Let's talk about ugly laws, disabilities, and LGBTQ. Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and welcome to Psycho Bible, babbling about psychology and theology. And this video is a bit of a follow-up to my previous video on K-pop demon hunters. The connection? Well, that previous video was all about shame, and how are we to respond to life experiences that are tainted by social stigma. So if you haven't watched that video on K-pop demon hunters, I highly recommend you check that one out, but you don't need to have watched it to understand where we're going to go with this video, though it really helps. Okay. Because I'm going to refer back to a few things I said in that video. And why is this so important to me? Well, this is poignant to me as a therapist. I happen to have some clients with very complex, chronic medical conditions. Some of them are dealing with rare diseases, with barely any treatments available, and barely any funding for research and developing treatments. And some of them are in wheelchairs. I hear their stories, and they have increased my awareness of the shaming that they experience even these days from all sectors of society, in church, at school, even from the very doctors meant to be helping them. They're often told that they just have functional neurological disorder, the fancy new name for conversion disorder. In other words, it's just in your head. Or you're having a physiological reaction to some psychological issue. You're not really dealing with an actual medical issue. And sort of, to me, it's what happens when doctors throw their hands in the air and they can't figure out what the problem is. So oftentimes they'll just refer them to psychiatry or to therapy, and just thinking that they just need to get good therapy and then the symptoms will go away. Well, I got clients who've been working with me for quite a while. The symptoms don't just go away, even though we're making progress in things like trauma and self-regulation skills and assertiveness and all the things that I would want to work on with them. They're still dealing with major medical issues. And so even from the very medical professionals who are supposed to be helping them, they're getting shaming messages. They experience the eye rolls, the suggestions that it's just in their head, there's nothing else they could do for them, not really being curious enough to investigate to see what else can be done, but just, hey, sorry, you got to figure it out on your own. So many of my clients, they've had to learn how to self-advocate. The years of working with such clients has been educational to me. And to illustrate the history of shame for people with disabilities, one client told me about ugly laws, something I had never even heard of before. So here's this article about the ugly history of Chicago's ugly law. It reads, in 1881, apparently with little debate or controversy, Chicago's city council passed a law barring all, quote, diseased, maimed, mutilated, unquote, people from the city's public streets. This was just one of a number of ugly laws passed in different parts of the country in the second half of the 19th century. How could such laws have passed? Well, the article continues, the law's passage followed years of dehumanizing reporting on disabled panhandlers. One 1875 Chicago Tribune article decried the disgraceful spectacle of, quote, a thoroughfare being obstructed by the hideous monstrosities, which are only half human, begging for alms, unquote. Another story warned that seeing a person with, quote, repulsive deformity, unquote, might present a serious danger to, quote, a lady in delicate health, unquote. Now, what's interesting is the ugly laws didn't apply to everyone with some sort of disability. The article continues, Coco writes that none of this reflected prejudice against the entire group of people we might today call disabled. Those who were employed and didn't receive public assistance were not understood to be bound by the ugly law. To 19th century employers, physical disability didn't necessarily mark a person as a less qualified worker. the real targets of the ugly law were defined less by their physical impairments than by their economic and social status. It goes on, it's no coincidence that the ugly law came at a time when many people were concerned about tramps roaming the country, while one of the biggest complaints about tramps was that they could work but chose not to. Coco writes that they were often discussed in the same breath with crippled beggars. For example, the Board of Public Charities described most people in Illinois poorhouses as old, infirm, crippled, lazy, and profligate. Here, people who could not find work due to disability were grouped alongside the lazy as part of the unworthy poor. And what's interesting, the article ends with a note here that the ugly law remained on the books until Chicago City Council finally removed it in 1973. Coco suggests that the history of the law should remind us that, then and now, disability refers not to a static category, but to a social position. So this idea of disability was really put on people only if they were not contributing to society. And so this is very fascinating to me, that there are these laws that actually made it illegal for you to be on the public streets if you had some sort of very physical disability, like if you're crippled, if you're in a wheelchair, if you had maybe a missing limb. But it mostly applied to those who were in those situations but were beggars. If you were able to still work, then you would not necessarily be subject to these ugly laws. Now, how they find that out, I'm not sure how this was enforced, because what if someone's on this public sidewalk or street because they're on their way to work? Like, were they constantly being harassed? I don't know. But just take note of that. It's very interesting that there is a bifurcation made between those who had some sort of disability but were able to still work, and those who were beggars but had disability. And so that brings us to this video that I want to just show some clips from. It's a very brief video from NowThis Impact. Now, I get it. If you're conservative, you see NowThis and you know that's left wing. And there's some left wing talking points in this, but this is just simply, there's a lot of objective facts in this about the history of the disability rights movement. So it's a video commemorating 30 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Race, ethnicity, gender, age, sexuality. People had to claw and scratch and fight and protest and pass legislation in order for those things to get recognized as valid. Let's walk through some of those significant moments in disability history. 1909. Let's talk a bit about the dark history of eugenics. For most of human history, disability has been a diagnosis, something to be cured, fixed, and cut out.
Now just take note of what he said here. I'll comment on it a little bit later.
Across the United States, from 1909 through the 1970s, disabled women, disabled men were put into institutions, were sterilized against their will and often without their knowledge. The words that were used, feeble-minded, idiot, moron, they were all meant to segregate and separate. The reverberations of that continue to play out now, 100 years later. 1935. If you hear the word sit-in, you're likely to think about the American South, the civil rights protests of African Americans. But decades before, in eastern cities like New York City, Manhattan, groups like the League of the Physically Handicapped were sitting in for their right to work. After the Great Depression, 1935, everybody was hit hard. People with disabilities were specifically excluded from projects from the Works Progress Administration under the FDR administration. People with disabilities who had met at a recreational center in New York City said, wait a minute, why should we settle for second-class status? And the day they sat down to meet, the sit-in began. One of the first recorded sit-ins in United States history. So why did it take a disabled historian, someone like Paul Longmore, to uncover this fact decades later? This should be taught alongside the Freedom Riders, alongside Stonewall. This is one of those moments where people said, we're going to demand access to the same things that everybody else gets to take for granted, and yet people don't know about it. Spring of 1977, disability rights activists in San Francisco and across the United States gathered to push, rally, and protest to make sure that regulations enacting Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act be put into law. Let's set the stage. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 prohibits discrimination due to disability in any programs, agencies, or by contractors receiving federal financial support. Going on 3 years later, but the regulations in order to enforce that law still have not been signed by Jimmy Carter. People with disabilities said, we want access to the things that other people are taking for granted. Federal buildings, education, employment initiatives. 1990. Nearly a decade after Section 504 protests, the stage was set to take it to the next level. Organizers such as Justin Dart and Yoshiko Dart met with activists in every state, rallying, organizing, protesting, ready to create what would become our own landmark civil rights legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Over 30,000 activists across the nation attended forums and gave testimonies to draw attention to the discrimination disabled people in America still faced, hoping to push Congress to approve the ADA.
When do we want it? Now! What do we want? ADA! When do we want it? Now! What do we want?
Archival footage of protesters outside the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Congressman Major Owens and Justin Dart addressed the crowd.
We are here today representing 43 million Americans with disabilities, forced by massive discrimination to be this nation's most isolated, unemployed, impoverished, and welfare-dependent minority. As discriminatory barriers are eliminated, citizens with disabilities in America and in all nations will become producers, taxpayers, consumers, and participants in the full richness of their cultures.
The power now is in the hands of the people here on this hill. The people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated.
What did it take to pass that law? Disability being disruptive. Washington, D.C., they climb out of their wheelchairs and they crawl up the steps of the United States Capitol.
Footage of 8-year-old Jennifer Keelan Chaffins crawling up the stairs.
I'll take it on Mike! I have to. You can do it!
We're almost there. We're almost ready to reach the mountaintop.
A symbolic illustration of the obstacles that have been in our way for decades, making that visceral, making that clear. We won't be left behind any longer.
Let's take a closer look at that amazing story of Jennifer Keelan climbing the steps of the Capitol as a little girl. This is powerful.
I remember when we were trying to get the ADA passed, and I need to climb the steps. I want to climb the steps, and Wade said, "Go for it." So I got out of my wheelchair and I started climbing. Well, the next thing I know, I've got 50 cameras on me, and I've got mics all over me, and it's like the hottest day, you know, the month of March, and I'm just, I mean, and I'm like, you know, I'm like 8, 9 years old, and I'm going, water, 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 I need water. And, you know, I've got the little pamphlet in the back of my pocket that we're supposed to hand over to the politicians to get the ADA passed. And they say that, that it was the image of me climbing those steps that, you know, was the final decision to get the ADA passed. And I mean, I had to do it.
All right. There are some important takeaways from this commentary given. He states that disabilities were viewed as diagnoses historically. And he says it with some sort of incredulity. But technically, disabilities are diagnoses. Like, you need to have a diagnosis of some sort to qualify for disability status. Well, he summarizes then the traditional view as one that sees disabilities as something to cure, fix, and cut out. Let's discuss the first two, to cure and fix. Medicine is about healing disorders and disabilities to enable people to engage in normative functioning. So yes, we ought to seek medical and therapeutic advancements in order to heal disabilities and diseases and disorders. Not to eradicate a class of people, but to eradicate barriers to fully participating in society and flourishing in life. Both saying the diagnosis view leads to the imperative to cut out the actual people with disabilities, hence his segue to eugenics, is a non sequitur. The mandate to kill, shun, and sterilize a whole population of persons does not follow from the understanding that the purpose of medicine is primarily seeking to heal and integrate. Certain groups reach such a conclusion that the disabled, diseased, or disordered person is unworthy to live, only if you buy into a utilitarian or subjectivistic moral ethic. The utilitarian ethic states that your value is only in how much you can provide a good for the collective. So someone with some sort of disability, maybe like they're in a wheelchair, well, their value is in only how much they can do that benefits others. So if they can't contribute to society and can't do everything that everyone else can do, they have decreased value. They're not, yes, we might as well get rid of them. If, say, someone has Down syndrome and they're not going to be really contributing much to society, they're not going to be like a teacher or a scientist, they're not going to be a famous athlete or actor, they're really going to be more of a burden on society because of how much care they'll need, and they're never going to be as intelligent as everyone else, so you might as well abort them in the womb, or which is essentially genocide in certain countries where they readily abort anyone with Down syndrome, or at least they suspect will have Down syndrome in the womb. And so essentially that's a type of genocide. It's euthanizing or eugenics. So let's control the population and keep it so that only people with a certain ability status are in society. So that's where utilitarian ethics gets you, where people have value only based on their abilities. Then there's the subjectivistic ethic, and that is that your value is self-determined, and it's based on your view of your quality of life. So if you're someone with some sort of disability and you're distressed and depressed, you're in despair over how that disability limits you, then yeah, your life does have less value according to this ethic. And so that's why we're seeing the rise of euthanasia in certain countries, where if your quality of life isn't up to a certain standard, whatever that standard may be, it's entirely subjective, then it's perfectly permissible for you to end your life on your terms. And even though you may recover, we don't know, from whatever the condition is that you're distressed over, you're right. You're presently too distressed. You're presently not experiencing a high quality of life. So you reserve the right to end it on your terms. And so there's the ethic here is that your life only has so much value based on what you feel, based on your subjective experience of your value. Both of these views, the utilitarian one and the subjectivistic one, are what contribute to the idea that personhood is separate from existence. It's what drives the abortion and euthanasia movements or industries. But there are some other positive takeaways from this survey of the history of the disability rights movement. What this survey shows us is the irony of our prejudices in society. When I read the article on the ugly laws, it pointed out that the ugly laws were meant to apply only to people taking advantage of public welfare, and not people with disabilities or impairments who are working and contributing to society. And yet, what we see with the efforts to protect the civil rights of people with disabilities was resistance from keeping disabled people from engaging and contributing to society. Like, they had to fight really hard to pass that Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. And what that would have done was just enable them to have equal opportunity to employment, to whatever services there are in our country, so that they can fully contribute and engage and participate in society. They shouldn't have had to fight for that if the sentiment that brought about the ugly laws was that they only applied to people who were just being a burden or a leech on society. But no, now you're seeing that, oh, well, no. Just the fact you have a disability, we're not interested in you contributing. That we're not going to, maybe because there's actual resistance or just an indifference toward people with disabilities getting the assistance they needed just to be able to have the opportunities to engage more in society, in particular in employment and the rights as a citizen, whether it's through participating in legislature and education, etc. The fight was to remove barriers from disabled people being part of our workforces and not to be as much a burden on society. Yes, that would require some forms of accommodations, but it would be worth it. I think about my clients with disabilities, even the ones in wheelchairs. They want to work. They do not want to be a burden on society. They want to not let their disability hinder them, hold them back. They do not want to be dependent on the system. They want to overcome and actually contribute to society. So when I think about the clients I have with that mentality, and really the sentiment of those who pushed and worked hard to pass the ADA, I find it so crazy that conservative voters and constituents and Republicans tend to not be as interested in disability services, in fighting for the rights of people with disabilities, in helping them have greater access and opportunities. If anything, it's conservatives and Republicans should actually be very much interested in uplifting disabled persons, so that way they will not be as much a burden on society financially, fiscally, but can actually be contributing members in different ways. It's weird to me Instead, disability rights have been more welcomed by the left, so it's become a left-wing cause. Which makes sense given what we know from Jonathan Haidt and his colleagues who expounded on moral foundations theory, showing us that typically those who lean more liberal really base their morals on the care foundation, caring for those who seem the weakest or the most unable to take care of themselves, the most vulnerable in our society. Whereas conservatives actually balance out their moral concerns among all of the different moral foundations. The care foundation, the fairness foundation, authority foundation, purity foundation, equality foundation, etc. Okay? And so we actually do care about those with disabilities. It's just spread out among all these other concerns as well. But I'd like to see that increase a bit more. Because if anyone is deserving of public welfare, it really is those with real disabilities, real impairments that inhibit them from being able to contribute. And so conservatives should be very much interested in the disability rights movement insofar as they are aimed at least insofar as they are aimed at empowering individuals to contribute towards society. It really should be embraced by everyone. It should not be a politicized issue. However, part of the problem is the debate over what qualifies as being disabled. So this brings us to what is called the social model. The starting point for the social model was the publication of the Fundamental Principles of Disability by the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation in 1976. It stated that, in our view, it is society which disables physically impaired people. Disability is something imposed on top of our impairments by the way we are unnecessarily isolated and excluded from full participation in society. This turned the understanding of disability completely on its head by arguing that it was not impairment that was the main cause of the social exclusion of disabled people, but the way society responded to people with impairments. Okay, this is critical. And I actually have mixed opinions on this. I see where they're coming from. However, the trap of this social model for disability is it is ultimately rooted in a social constructivist view of reality. It purports that normality, at least it's vulnerable to purporting this, is merely a social construct. And if it's a social construct, it's one they accuse of historically prejudicing against people with physical and mental impairments. They disagree that the impairment is the disability itself. Rather, the disability is the limitations posed by society. However, this definition undermines the very idea of the person having an impairment at all. It all becomes subjective. So I hope this is not a straw man, but as an example, I could see them construing it so that someone with some form of paralysis, that the person cannot walk, they could say that, well, the person's inability to walk is not a disability. It's only a disability because our society requires people to walk. If society would be one that accommodated people who cannot walk, then there would be no such thing as a disability. But then that would ultimately be changing the viewpoint of this person even having what they would admit before was an impairment, the inability to walk. Now, I will admit that, yes, if people have an inability to walk, then the fact that we have things like curbs that you have to step over to go from the street to the sidewalk, that we have steps to get to front doors, that we have staircases to get to the next floor. These sort of things do get in the way of someone who has that impairment. And a society that is caring would find ways to rectify that. Now, that can be rectified in a couple different ways. One would be to bring cure to the person with the inability to walk, enabling them to walk, if at all possible. Such as if someone lost a limb and they could instead have a prosthetic limb. Okay, that might rectify it in that way. But then there are those for whom that is not a possibility. And so what would help them would be some other form of accommodation, such as elevators or handicap ramps, or say, for example, people who are blind, having braille on signs, having street crossing signs that also are verbal, so people can hear, not just wait to see if it's safe to walk. So there's all these different accommodations that wouldn't be too much of a burden on society and would actually benefit more than just a person with the disability. So a lot of times when we increase accessibility and make accommodations, they benefit everyone. So if we don't care for people in society with disabilities, then yes, we are getting in their way of, or allowing situations to get in their way more, when we actually have the ability to enable them to engage in society, to participate, to contribute as well. So I can see their point, however, to ultimately say that the disability is really only society and not the fact that the person is not functioning according to their actual design. There's a problem there, and that can end up being exploited. And here's how. Sadly, I think we're seeing a shift in more recent years that is disturbing. An increasing number of this younger generation is claiming to be disabled in some way, usually in the category of trauma, which irks me because I actually work with people with trauma, but people are claiming that the smallest things are traumatic for them, or neurodivergence, or they would prefer to say neurodiversity, in order to not be expected to work and to argue to be dependent on welfare. These types of individuals want inclusion, but they do not want responsibility. Just by way of illustration, check out this clip, a hilarious one to me, from the 2019 Democrat Socialists of America National Convention.
Quick point of privilege. Quick point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Guys, first of all, James Jackson, Sacramento, he, him. I just want to say, can we please keep the chatter to a minimum? I'm one of the people who's very, very prone to sensory overload. There's a lot of whispering and chatter going on. It's making it very difficult for me to focus. Please, can we just, I know we're all fresh and ready to go, but can we please just keep the chatter to a minimum? It's affecting my ability to focus. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, is there a speaker against name, chapter, pronouns?
Point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Please do not use gendered language to address everyone.
Okay.
Quick point of privilege once again. Quick point of privilege once again. Hi, James Jackson, Sacramento DSA, he, him. I have already asked people to be mindful of the chatter of their comrades who are sensitive to sensory overload, and that goes double for the heckling and the hissing. It is also triggering to my anxiety. Like, the be comradely isn't just for, like, you know, let's keep things civil or whatever. It's so that people aren't gonna get triggered and so that it doesn't affect their performance as a delegate, okay? Your need to express yourself is important, but your need to express yourself should not trump or over, like...
I see that no one's clapping for me. It could be because I'm not engaging, but it also is because everyone's doing this. And that's really important, because those loud bursts of noise, even though this is a noisy space, when we can do something like reducing that, that's really important. So please don't clap, shoot up these. We have a lot of disabled comrades, and a lot of those are invisible disabilities. You don't know who it is that is having a more difficult time navigating this space, and this space was not created with all of their needs in mind. So it's up to us to modify that space to make sure that everybody is able to move in the ways that they need to move. And additionally, with the noise issue, like avoid hissing, avoid waving banners, right? Because there's all sorts of things. If you don't know what to do, show up these, right? I'm sure there's lots of ways that we can communicate to each other without needing to rely on something that's going to hurt somebody else. We have quiet rooms that are available. There's a range of options of these, right? Please don't go into that space with anything that's like an aggressive scent, for instance, right? Because we don't want to put people in stressful situations that they don't consent to, right? And there are right-wing infiltrators who are trying to get in here, but it's going to be really traumatic for people if we're not making an affirmative effort to de-escalate each other and de-escalate ourselves, right?
Just see how many people who were pushing for socialism, really communism, in America also claim some sort of disability. And this is also highlighted in this clip from Patrick Bet-David's Surrounded episode with Jubilee.
So mentally ill, so that was something I had to deal with, but I'm mainly mentally ill because I am disabled in a capitalist country.
Tell me more about mentally ill. Who qualified you as somebody that's mentally ill?
Me and my doctor team.
Who convinced you that you're mentally ill?
Me and my doctor team.
What's the specific category of mental illness? Is there one? You know why I asked this question? Let me explain to you why I asked this question.
So I don't even like the psychological industry. I don't really stand for like Sigmund Freudian politics or anything like that. I don't have access to even a result or a solution to my disability as someone with a connective tissue disorder. It's genetic.
Have you been able to go to different doctors and get yourself tested? And
yeah.
See? You have?
Yes.
And in California?
Yes, but not enough. I can't find a specialist.
You can't find a specialist?
I can't find a specialist
for who I am.
Is there anyone
in your life that's willing to pay for a specialist?
Well, they could, or they would if they had money, but yeah.
Would you be okay if I pay for a specialist for you to go see?
Yeah.
Would you take money from a capitalist to help you go see specialist?
I mean, yeah, sure, why not?
I'm going to have you go see two, do you live in California?
Yeah.
I'm going to have you go see two specialists, but would you also be open to seeing somebody else I choose as a psychologist that may...
No.
You're not.
No.
So you
choose as a psychologist. You're choosing who gets to determine what my mental health looks like. No. Okay,
then I wish you nothing but the best.
I notice this girl apparently has a true disability or disorder. She has a connective tissue disorder. I have clients with that condition. It certainly is disabling. Limbs pop out of joints easily. It limits mobility, and treatments are very limited. So there's some physical impairment there. How much that disables her from being able to contribute to society, I don't know. There's desk jobs. There are other jobs that she could do. Look, she's probably not going to have some sort of manual labor job. She'll probably be okay without that. But she also says that her mental illness makes her disabled in a capitalist society. See how instead of having the attitude that those who fought for the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, how they wanted to have access to employment, she's looking for a way out of being employed, period, so that she can just get the government to take care of her. Okay? See how things have changed. We went from the people who pushed for the ADA wanting to participate in a capitalist economy to now we're seeing people use disabilities, whether or not they actually have them, legitimately, I do not know, to fight for communism. There's been a major shift over the past couple generations. Now, I want to empower my clients and to live optimally, to live life to their fullest. And I'd also tell my clients that my job is to help them live in reality. And particularly for my clients with chronic medical conditions or disabilities, that oftentimes means accepting the reality that in order for them to have autonomy and engage in community to the extent they can, it may require some form of ongoing assistance. It's a catch-22 at times. We want to empower clients and help them grow in having autonomy and be able to care for themselves, as well as increase their capacity to be in community. But on the other hand, there are limitations to what they can do, to how much autonomy they really have. And so we have to live in that reality. We want to encourage them to enhance their life as much as possible, to overcome it as much as possible, while also accepting the reality when there's not much more they can do. And so this ties us back to my commentary on K-pop Demon Hunters. In that video, I was responding to Jonathan Pageau's take on the movie, in which he decried the self-esteem messaging as the solution to shame, reinforcing the idea that people with something shameful about themselves should be hidden away and work on correcting that shameful thing. In my commentary, I argue that Jonathan's view is valid if we are speaking of shame due someone for their willful sin. But for people experiencing shame over things about themselves that are not moral issues, not matters of their own choice, such as people with disabilities, his approach would likely increase illegitimate shame and do more damage. Yes, we should always seek healing to the extent we can. But in our imperfect world, when even healing is incomplete, we need to also seek to optimize autonomy and community belonging. How? Well, I think a solution is in something that Jonathan once told me in person years ago, back in 2018. Early in his speaking career, I got to see him in person speaking at an Orthodox church in Souderton, PA. That's also where I first met Father Andrew Stephen Damick, the co-host of the Lord of Spirits podcast, which I've mentioned several times on this channel. And when I went to that particular speaking engagement, I brought my camcorder, which was fortunate because neither the church nor Jonathan Pageau had his own camera crew at the event. So his video on his channel was actually my footage that I sent to him afterwards. And I had the blessing of hanging out afterwards with him and several others. They had like a reception time at the church, so I got to sit next to Jonathan, talk with him, as well as Father Andrew Stephen Damick, and talk with some others. And really engaging, really interesting conversation. But at one point, I got to ask him a question, which I talked about in this video in which I talked about that whole experience. I did get a moment, and there was a question I've been wanting to ask him for a while, so I took the opportunity to ask him, because in other videos he mentioned how he used to live in Africa and work with, I forget which nation it was. I don't want to say it if it's wrong, but he was working with artisans there and helping them get businesses started, and that's actually where he really got started with carving, because before that he was more of a painter. And he learned carving, or started practicing carving more there in Africa, and learning from them their symbols. And he said before that their shapes are their symbolic language. So he mentioned that in one of his previous videos, and so I was really curious about that. So I brought that up to him. You had mentioned before how the tribe you're with, that the shapes had symbolic meaning, and so I was curious, what were some of those symbolisms? So he shared a couple of them, because I'm always curious to see how universal symbols are, even if it's just in the matter of a shape and not just a picture of a person, or just fascinated with the universality of our symbols. And so say if a design had a square, which represents like a closed space, that represent containment, and particularly for people who were insane. And he was mentioning how there's, in their culture, the way they would treat someone who was mentally unstable would be they would attach something heavy, like say an engine, a car engine, and they'd be chained to it. So they can't run away. They're on a leash, but it still provides them with a certain degree of mobility. They just have to pick up their engine and walk around. And that's a fascinating concept. They can still be in the community. They're not isolated, but at the same time, they're not totally free. But they still get to associate with people. So that would be the containment. And then if there was like a square or some sort of shape like a square that was open on one end, then that would represent like a bird being set free, which would represent freedom. So fascinating that in the patterns and the shapes, there's story. So once again, there's meaning in everything. I found this so interesting, and I've been wanting to talk about this for years on my channel. So here's the opportunity. The square equals containment. How you treat someone with mental insanity is chaining the person to something heavy. It may limit the mobility, but enables social connection. Now we're talking about mental insanity, but perhaps this might just be a way of understanding people with disabilities in general. Not that you intentionally put a chain to them, but they already are chained by their disability in some way. But what you want to do is find ways to enable and enhance their social connection, which is so critical. My clients with disabilities, they'll tell me the hardest part is the inaccessibility, the lack of connection, the isolation that comes, people not including them in events, asking them to participate in things, assuming that they're not able to come to things, when if they were just to ask, they'd find a way to make it happen. And so that social cohesion is the biggest thing they're starved for. And then with the symbolism there from the African people that Jonathan worked with, there's the open shape. Freedom, like a bird set free. So certain people may either need to be contained or just simply are by the reality of their condition. And others, we want to enhance their capacity for freedom. And I would say we want to do that for all people to whatever extent we can. Now, the challenge, of course, comes back to how do we determine how much capacity people have? How do we determine disability? Ludmila Praslova, in her Psychology Today article, Neurodivergence and Disability, Beyond the Checkbox Trap, says, the conversation shouldn't start and end with labeling someone as disabled or neurodivergent. The real work is in designing systems that allow people to thrive regardless of where they land in a Venn diagram or legal definitions. Think of it this way. Accommodations equals short-term, limited fixes to help someone learn or work. Accessibility equals thoughtful design that removes barriers for all, whether disabled or not. Inclusion equals culture shift, building workplaces, schools, and communities where asking for help isn't seen as a weakness, where everyone is protected, where being different does not mean having to justify your existence. Now, that last part might be a bit over dramatic. It could be that people, in the way current things oftentimes are, isn't so much that they have to justify their existence, but perhaps at least have to justify their engagement, their participation, instead of just existing but not doing anything. Instead of ugly laws and relegating people with disabilities to the shadows, let's see how we can facilitate their participation in school, work, church, family, and the community. But we can do this without denying the reality of what normative functioning is. We must not render everything into some sort of social construct. Legs are meant for walking. If you are unable to walk, it is not merely society that disables you. A caring society will seek to offer two things: cures when possible, and accessibility for those who are uncured. Cutting the uncured out of society is not the logical solution. It doesn't follow from this understanding of there being a diagnosis, something to treat. If you're familiar with my channel, you know I most commonly address matters of sexuality. So you might be anticipating me connecting this all to sexuality. And I was going to make this like 2 separate videos, but part 2 would rely so much on part 1, I didn't want people to miss what I said in part 1. So here's part 2, where I want to connect things to LGBTQ and side A and side B, gay Christianity, and all of this sort of how do we address homosexuality and gender identity confusion in society and in the church. In the NowThis Impact video, Lawrence Carter Long said that for most of human history, disability has been a diagnosis, something to be cured, fixed, and cut out. He then goes on to decry the history of eugenics. From 1909 through the 1970s, people with disabilities were institutionalized and sterilized against their will or even against their knowledge. And throughout the video, he peppers in mentions of the gay rights movement. Well, in my video on my AACC presentation, explaining why there's so much opposition to therapy for exploring change in sexuality, I mentioned the 3 lenses explicated by Dr. Mark Yarhouse: the integrity lens, the disability lens, and the diversity lens. I actually heard Mark Yarhouse speak at the AACC conference, and in his presentation at AACC, he said he sees value in each lens. But he personally is an advocate of the disability lens, as are most people in the side B gay Christian camp. Yarhouse defines them this way: the integrity lens is to view these different sexual identities, these non-heterosexual sexual orientations and gender identities, as problems to be fixed, indicators of wounding or sin. Now, primarily, he sort of used as the example what I call the mortification stream, or the side Y approach, where they just reduce same-sex attraction and gender identity confusion down to a sin issue. And so he described the integrity lens as, oh, this is a problem to correct. This is a sin issue that needs to be fixed. You need to have sexual and gender integrity, meaning you need to be in alignment with what is true. Okay, I think that is a straw man of the integrity lens. Because if you were to take into consideration those of us in the transformation stream, or what's oftentimes called side X, we agree that sin plays a major role, but also woundedness, developmental deficits, distorted thinking, all these things that really contribute to the vulnerability to a particular sin, but are not in and of themselves sin. Their experiences, their challenges that we face, and what is the sin is our way of responding to those challenges. And so, to me, an integrity lens would be looking at the same-sex attraction or the gender identity confusion as signals of deeper underlying issues. Yes, insofar as you are acting on those propensities and actually engaging in real sin, there is a sin issue to address and repent of, and therefore to have integrity in that way. But the word integrity primarily means wholeness and healing. So for me, coming from the transformation stream, the integrity lens is to view these things as indicators of deeper rooted issues that need healing. And as those areas are addressed and are brought into right order, God willing, that'll have an impact on the person's emotional experience, whether we're talking about the emotions of sexual arousal and sexual desire and attractions, or the emotions of their experience of their gendered self. Okay, so I'm going to correct Mark Yarhouse there when it comes to what he calls the integrity lens. How he defines the disability lens is that it's a condition to endure. something to accommodate. Basically, the same lens that we're talking about here, to help the people have accommodations, accessibility, and inclusion, but not try to change, because it is what it is. It cannot be changed. So don't give people false hope about changing their disability. Just enable them to be able to enter into church life, into having a relationship with God, despite what they would consider their ongoing affliction. And so this is essentially the mentality of side B gay Christianity, that they look at it as, oh, we are this population who has been overlooked by the church. We need to make sure that we are seen, that we have representation, and that people know that this is what we are. Don't try to fix us. Don't try to cure us. Just accommodate us. Make it so that we can belong in the church. And so whether it be because we are single and celibate, and so we need to make sure the church is a place for people who are living a single life, or that we reduce stigma of those who have ongoing same-sex attractions even as they are in what they would call mixed orientation marriages. Or we need to accommodate by sublimating our sexual desires and entering into spiritual friendships, basically sexless committed gay unions or same-sex unions. So maybe one person has same-sex attraction but the other doesn't, but they're going to be in such a committed friendship that they're basically codependent. So that's the disability lens that the side B uses. They're not interested in working on the underlying root issues. Okay? So, that's disability lens. The diversity lens is what you see promoted in the mainstream, in the secular world, as well as in the side A gay Christian world, the affirmation stream. That your sexual orientation, particularly your non-heterosexual sexual orientation, is an identity that is meant to be celebrated and promoted as an aspect of diversity in our community. Diversity is like a good in and of itself. And so they are co-opting civil rights language that's typically used for civil rights based on ethnicity or skin color, and saying, well, hey, we have this immutable characteristic, our sexual orientation, and it's not even a problem. It's something for us to celebrate. So we're not going to try to fix it, and we're not going to be in despair over it. Like, hey, I can't help that I was born this way. We want to celebrate it. And so society should celebrate it too. They're not just looking for tolerance. They're looking for celebration. And honestly, I see aspects of this lens in the side B gay world as well. They might not go so far in celebrating it that they'll promote homosexual behavior and gay marriage. They might draw the line there, but I see some bending of the rules here and there. They'll oftentimes use some sort of justification, defense mechanisms, saying that, oh, no, I'm not really lusting after someone of the same sex, I'm just appreciating their beauty. And it gets into some murky waters, we'll say that. You can see now the overlap with the conversation about disabilities. Well, when the integrity lens, or diagnosis approach, is conflated with eugenics, then it's no wonder why this side A, who used the diversity lens, and the side B, who used the disability lens and aspects of the diversity lens, have such virulent hostility against those of us in ex-LGBT ministries and who offer sexual attraction fluidity exploration in therapy. They think by us offering to help people with unwanted same-sex attraction or gender identity confusion, we're basically trying to exterminate a population of people. Because once you make your sexuality your identity, just like once you make your disability your identity, an offer of some sort of treatment that could help reduce the disability or the unwanted same-sex attraction or gender identity issue is viewed as an offer to reduce who you are, to cut away part of who you are. So there's actually a defense built in against healing and integration, and I would say actual maturation. Because like, oh, you're trying to wipe away my existence. This is why you see these protesters whenever people talk about, say, the trans issue. It's more prominent these days. You'll hear people talk about this, and they call it a mental illness. The more of the right wing types or the libertarians will at least refer to it as mental illness. People say, no, it's not, because they know mental illness is meant to be treated. No, it's not. They get really hostile, and they'll use this like catastrophizing language, like, you're trying to erase my existence. If you don't use their pronouns, you're denying my existence. Like, no, I'm not. I'm trying to affirm the reality of who you actually are, not to affirm a delusion. But no, if you don't affirm their view of themselves, then you're denying their actual existence, and they view that as violence. Hence, the trend of violence among the trans that we're seeing. This all reminds me of a time when early in my marriage, when I was looking for a job while I was still in school, and I was interviewed at a place that was like a group home for people with schizophrenia. And when they heard that I was a psychology major, they told me, do not expect progress with these individuals. The mission of the home was to help them with daily living and feeling comfortable. All right, the type of counsel that is provided here is not one that will help them change. And that is essentially the disability lens right there. All right, the counsel that you're expected to give in the side B gay Christian world is helping them feel like they belong. So this is the idea. If you're offering help to help change an aspect of their experience, that's violence against them. The only type of thing you should be doing as a therapist, or really these days therapist activist, is to change society or to change the church, to be more accommodating and accepting and like inclusive of those who disagree with the historic sexual ethic of the church, or who have some struggle with their same-sex attraction, or just not even a struggle, but just experience same-sex attraction. And they might not struggle with it as much as they embrace it, even if they're not even fully acting out on it. So that disability lens that leads to counseling that is only to help people feel comfortable, to reduce shame, which is important either way, that may be true of a wide range of chronic medical conditions and severe mental illness. But it's a defeatist mentality when we apply that to areas of sanctification and sexual integration and maturation. This is illustrated in Greg Johnson's book, Still Time to Care, in which he argues that all the ex-gay ministries were failures, and so the church should abandon what he calls the cure model and embrace a care model that only concerns itself with helping LGBTQ identified Christians be included in the church. See the accommodation, accessibility, and inclusion aims for disabled persons. Basically, everything you see as the aims for providing care for people with disabilities, he applies to how the church should approach same-sex attraction or gender identity confusion. Now, I say the problem is when the church and society have too rigid a standard for sexuality change, particularly one that is determined by feelings rather than functioning. Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Sr. always said that normality is that which functions according to design. He didn't say normality is that which feels according to design, and I agree with him. Yes, ideally, feelings would be in alignment with behavior and with your design. Like, for me as a man, for me to feel sexual attraction and arousal toward women is a feeling that is aligned with my design. That would be ideal. But throughout Scripture, we see the principle that we are judged based on what we do, not what we feel. See the parable of the obedient son versus the disobedient son. You had one son who expressed a desire to do his father's instruction and said, yes, Dad, I'll go do it. Dad gives him some sort of instruction, some chore to do. And he says readily, yes, I'll do it. But then he doesn't. Whereas another son says, no, I don't want to do that. He has no intention, no desire to do the chore that his father gave him. But then he goes and does it anyway. Who was the son who honored his father? The one who did it, even though he didn't want to, even though his feelings weren't there, even though his heart wasn't in it. He still obeyed. The one who had good intentions, had good feelings, but did not do the Father's will, was not obedient. So that's just one example of many that we'll see throughout Scripture, that we're judged by what we end up choosing to do, how our will aligns with God's will, not based on our emotions, not based on your sexual arousal, not based on your fantasies that come up intrusively that you didn't ask for, that you God willingly resisted. We're not judged according to those. We're judged according to what you choose to do with those feelings. And so my response to Greg Johnson, a truly caring approach, is one that facilitates greater wholeness and maturity. Now, by maturity, I mean that you move increasingly toward the end of sexual development, which is to be ready and willing to offer yourself as a free, full, faithful, and God-willing fruitful gift of self to a person of the opposite sex, the one you marry, and to mutually receive someone in that same way. Such sexual maturity exists independent of being married, because it is about one's readiness for mutual self-giving, not whether or not it's been actualized. We're not guaranteed the actualization of giving and receiving the gift. And this standard may be satisfied even if you do not experience passionate sexual arousal and desire for the opposite sex in the same way as the typical straight guy. So yes, I agree. We do need to reduce shame about our sexual attractions that deviate from the norm. Okay? But we need to set a standard that it's not required for your feelings to fully change in order for the care you receive to have been effective. Okay? It doesn't need to be considered a full cure. Only if your feelings have categorically changed from same-sex attracted to opposite-sex attracted. If there's a mix, if it's more state-dependent, based on the mood or the attitude about yourself that you're currently experiencing, the mentality that you're having, the stress level you have, the types of temptations in your life. If that is more of a determinant of the types of attractions or fantasies or desires you're experiencing, that does not negate the change that you may experience in growing in sexual integration, having integrity, and maturation. And it may be that you change on a continuum in your feelings as well. It's not typically, we all admit, no one in my field is claiming that people change frequently from exclusively same-sex attracted to exclusively opposite-sex attracted. We all understand it's on a continuum somewhere. But that degree of change is still very helpful for people in living a life that is more aligned with God's will for them. And I work hard with my clients to reduce that shame about not experiencing that degree of change that they would most like to have. I got some clients who they shame themselves because they have such pressure on themselves to be this ideal, typical, stereotypical rather, straight guy. And being anywhere along the continuum of change is unacceptable to them. Like, I'm sorry, I try to temper their expectations, help them live in reality, as I often say. But either way, good care, good therapy is to facilitate as much as possible that integration and maturation, to at least become someone who is in a state of readiness and willingness to enter into a relationship that is a free, full, faithful, and fruitful gift of self. If we fall into the trap of defining sexuality by sexual arousal and desire, which is what I call the sexual orientation paradigm, then when someone does not routinely experience passionate sexual arousal and desire for the opposite sex, we conclude that this person has some sort of disability. The message is that you are unable to participate in heteronormativity, to use a term I don't like, all because the feelings do not meet a societal standard. You instead have sexual divergence or sexual diversity. And with that mentality, you will believe you have the imperative to re-engineer society or the church, to accommodate and include, even celebrate people whose sexual desires and arousal patterns don't seem to match what is designated as straight. And this is why we see side B so often criticize the church at large for idolizing marriage. This is why they adopt queer theory terminology. Why Nate Collins, founder of the Revoice Conference, used critical queer theory in his dissertation at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary to argue for the recognition of virgin as its own gender identity. It's all this idea that your feelings determine your ontology, that it makes you a certain type of person. And if it's not fitting the norm, then it makes you disabled in some way. The disability lens for sexuality sells people short and concretizes people in sexual underdevelopment or arrested development. So, what is the alternative? What's the solution? What I have consistently argued is that same-sex attraction is an adaptation, an unconscious reaction that indicates something awry in one's sexual integration and maturation process. That same-sex attraction is not itself a disability. Disability lens advocates believe they need to promote the disability lens approach through typical born gay messaging in order to elicit people's compassion toward people with same-sex attraction. But the born gay narrative, the sexual orientation paradigm, does not necessarily prompt people to have more kindness toward people with SSA. What we can learn from the history of how disabled persons were treated is that if you see people as having a disability that is unchangeable and causes a burden on society, then those people are worthy of extermination. To be clear, to all of you who want to censor me, that is not my position. This is one of the main reasons why the born gay narrative is not my position, because it ultimately does more harm to people with SSA. See, right now it seems like it does all this good because the activists have so convinced society to celebrate LGBTQ. But if you're paying attention, you notice there's a growing backlash. And if you keep pushing this narrative that people are just born gay, or born trans, or whatever, and now people in society are starting to get fed up with LGBTQ, well, then they're going to look at that as, oh, then these are people who are born this way that we now don't like, and so we can use eugenics to genocide them. Instead of having actual compassion, when you see people as just having a immutable trait and you no longer like those people, then you just gave them kind of a easy way to categorize and sanction them. And that is not what I want to see happen. I want to see people walk in wholeness and healing, not in being shamed and worse. People with same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria are intrinsically valuable because all people are made in God's image. And it is because they are made in God's image that promoting false ideas about their ontology is wrong. It's not kind and compassionate. It sets them up to be harmed and victimized by the homosexual behavior itself and relationships, by despair and mental anguish, by damaging their bodies, by precluding their capacity to produce life, sterilizing and mutilating their genitalia, if we're talking about gender identity issues, or simply entering into a gay marriage where you naturally cannot produce life through that union. Once you give up on the possibility of wholeness, eugenics suddenly appears quite reasonable. See the increasing use of euthanasia for people who claim they are disabled. So we cannot just assume that everyone will perceive it as a good thing to celebrate to be told that they are born LGBTQ. Someone will look at that as a death sentence. And we need a more hopeful message than just, okay, well, we'll just change society so that you won't feel like it's so bad anymore. Yes, we do need to change society to a degree so that people with same-sex attraction or people with personalities that are not as gender typical do not feel such debilitating shame that they don't express what they're experiencing and don't seek help. And really their shame gets in the way of their help. Like when I'm working with clients, if they have so much tremendous shame and anxiety, it interferes with the change process. So we need to have reduction in shame so that people can enter into the care models, the therapy approaches and counseling approaches with curiosity and self-compassion, which is what's necessary to experience healing and change. And so yes, society does need to change to a degree. I often talk about on my channel or in interviews about how we need to correct the very limited and narrow ideas of what it means to be masculine, what it means to be a man. That we just honor the masculine stereotype or the warrior archetype about what it means to be a man. And as well for women, that oftentimes it's reduced to just being the beautiful, dainty, damsel in distress model. That, you know, these are archetypes that hold truth, but they're not the whole truth about what it means to be a man or a woman. And so yes, societally, we do need to make some changes to celebrate the multiple archetypes for men and women. And recognize that even so, you're still a man, you're still a woman, and you're still a man made for woman, and you're still a woman made for man. So, in this life, we do not know the extent we can experience wholeness. So we strive for it nonetheless. We equip churches and develop ministries and train therapists to facilitate as much sexual healing and growth as possible. We do this because a person is already valuable, not in order to make the person valuable. Not say, oh, you must become straight in order for us to see you as worthy to belong to the church. No. One, I don't use terms like straight and gay, but rather, hey, you're a man, you're a woman, whatever the case is. And yeah, you might have these particular sexual attractions and struggles, but that's not who you are. That does not define you. And you do not need to experience complete change in that in order for you to belong. But it's because you're so valuable, because you're made in God's image, that you ought to pursue healing in that area to whatever extent God is offering you in this life. Find out what the upper limit is for you. Don't settle for saying, this is just what I am. This is how I'll be the rest of my life. That's the fatalist, defeatist mentality of side B. So we need to remove barriers to participation in community and church life while holding firmly to standards of conduct and messaging. Our culture continues to have ugly laws toward the ex-LGBT community when they mock people who testify to leaving a gay life, let alone eviscerating them if they are honest about any continuing struggles with same-sex attractions or temptations. In the church, we can have our own versions of ugly laws when we allow only those who fit a certain stereotype of masculinity or femininity to lead in ministry or to share their testimonies openly. To view the same-sex attraction or gender confusion as an indicator of a deeper problem doesn't therefore mean cutting the person out until they are presentable enough. It means coming alongside them, working with them toward their greater integration and maturation, and protecting them from attack as well. So some people maybe aren't ready to be so public with their testimony. But it also means that as they are ready to share a bit, we accept the reality that most people are in transition. When I say transition, I do not mean gender transition, but they're in transition as in they're in process of maturing. They're in process of healing and integrating. It's messy. We have to accept the mess and celebrate the wins as they come. And so, yeah, that means don't expect people to have a perfect testimony when they're ready to start sharing. Even the greatest leaders still have struggles. So we need to just accept that as a reality. Don't have a standard that they be absolutely 100% changed in order to be actually out there in some way. Now, I say this meaning that even though I've often preached that there should be a season of testing before they're out there in public. Okay, so I get that. But I'm not just talking about like being on stage or having a ministry that you're running. Sometimes it just means being able to be open with people in your small community, with your family, with your friends. And we need to be able to have such kindness toward those who are struggling with anything, whether we're talking about gender or sexuality or any other sin issue or area of weakness, whatever thorn in the flesh you may have. That people can be honest about their flaws and their falls, their shortcomings, their weaknesses, their temptations, and not get condemnation in return, but get patience, encouragement to do what's right. Sometimes it means a hard word, but also a listening ear to inquire and dig out what's the root issue that needs to be healed and worked on. But at the same time, we do not compromise on reality in the name of accommodation. Whether or not you ever marry, and whether or not you ever have a radical change in your sexual attractions or your sense of gender identification, the church and society must uphold the truth that you are a man or woman based on the design of your body, and you are a man made for woman or a woman made for man. No gender dysphoria or same-sex attraction changes those truths. You are not exempt from the reality of your body and the call to unite in one flesh unless you specifically hear from God that you're meant to be celibate to serve Him in the kingdom. Okay? But you're also not guaranteed a spouse either. You know, it could be slim pickings either way. So, to go back to the African symbolism that Jonathan Pageau taught me, we need to help liberate as many people as we can, helping them experience the true freedom that comes from living in alignment with God's will, and then contain those who are not yet whole, while enabling them to participate in community, getting the very nurture and help that they so desperately need. So, let us not perpetuate more ugly laws by having unrealistic and unfair standards for those with some form of actual disability or a struggle with their sexuality, with their root issues, with their sense of gender. And let's reduce the shame while promoting their maximization of their true potential, their true identity. I hope this winding sort of presentation today made some dots connect for you. Maybe there's some ideas that sparked in your mind as I was sharing. So if so, please leave a comment in the comment section. Hit the like button. It really does help. Share and subscribe. Until next time, please know that Jesus loves you freely, fully, faithfully, and fruitfully. Take care.